Thank you very much again for coming and joining us. God, it is bright out there, isn't it? For another evening of a performance lecture from one of our artists who are involved in the programme. Angela Washko is an artist, writer and facilitator devoted to creating new forms of discussion of feminism in spaces frequently hostile towards it. Since 2012, Washko has operated the Council on Gender Sensitivity and Behavioural Awareness in the world of Warcraft, an ongoing intervention inside the most popular online role-playing game of all time. And you can see 2 of the films from this series actually in our exhibition at Casco Photodoc, which is about half an hour away, but you should definitely go and see it before it closes on November the 12th. She's currently an assistant professor of art at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also exhibited nationally and internationally at venues including but not limited to Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, Kiasma Museum of Contemporary Art in Helsinki, Shenzhen Independent Animation Biennial, Whitney Museum of American Art, the Andy Warhol Museum, and the Rotterdam International Film Festival. Now, we're really pleased to bring Angela to Utrecht, and that's with the very generous help of the Het Nieuwe Institute's International Visitors Programme, with the support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, we're going to hear from Angela. And a little bit later, I'm going to join her for a Q&A where you can ask any of your burning questions, but she might need your help first, though. Warm welcome for Angela.
So yeah, I'm Angela Washko, and I'm a research-based artist making video games, written works, videos, performances, and interventions, often within video game and internet enclave contexts. Today I'm going to walk you through a participatory playthrough of a video game I've been developing, but I'm going to give a kind of introduction to the culture surrounding that game and my own practice before we do that together. Through my sort of presentation today, you'll see a couple of works focusing on informal niche languages formed in specific online communities, from massively multiplayer role-playing games to online manosphere forums, which I'll explain in a bit. Just so you know, I will be presenting some sexual content in some of the work, and I'll try to give adequate warnings when we get there. Great, that's still working. Okay, so I'm going to start with one project to give you a sense of what kinds of processes and politics are informing the work that I'll show after it. And again, this is also some of the works within this project are also in the festival's exhibition, so you can see it in person. Hooray! For 4 years, I created performative interventions inside the multiplayer online role-playing video game World of Warcraft. Instead of killing enemies and getting badass equipment like I had for 6 years prior to its founding, as the Council on Gender Sensitivity and Behavioral Awareness in World of Warcraft, I started traveling to highly populated virtual towns in the game to discuss the ways in which women were treated in the game space with other players. WoW has a player base that's pretty notorious for being quite hostile toward women, people of color, as well as queer and gender nonconforming people. So I sought to figure out why exchanges in this other very fantasy-looking landscape reflected and reinforced the stereotypical politics of everyday life instead of, perhaps liberating us from them, as earlier cyberfeminists may have hoped for. So from 2012 to 2016, I facilitated public conversations in the game space, which were often very lengthy, some lasting as long as 8 hours, and covered topics including why so many men choose to play female avatars, the answer being to project and own their fantasy figures in the game space, why many male players think that women are biologically predisposed to be worse at video games than men, how women facing harassment in the space deal with that experience, why "go back into the kitchen and make me a sandwich" became such a common phrase among the player base, why so many of the diverse players who once played WoW had started leaving, and why feminism was the most polarizing word I could possibly say in the space, among many other more unexpected topics. The project shifted in intention from initially wanting to change the communal language in the space to ultimately realizing how colonial that impulse was, and shifting to trying to create a constant presence and public visibility for the issues of exclusivity that marginalized players face in the space by meeting and talking about it regularly, like here. Through the 4 years of the project, the council had a generally appreciated and active presence on the primary server I played on, and an intentional, inclusive guild was created as a result of regularly hosting these conversations, as the community came up with long-term ways for the project to live on without my facilitation, which was sort of my goal. The project also became a prototype for other interventions and actions in other multi-user game spaces, and I hope that perhaps it could continue to generate discussion and change around how designers and developers can be held accountable for what happens in their spaces and work toward creating more inclusive environments. That's my fastest description of that project ever. So there's a lot of nuance and also self-criticality missing. If you are interested in learning more about some of the nuances of the project, there's a pretty comprehensive essay I wrote for Creative Time called Why Talk Feminism in World of Warcraft, and it's on their website and also mine. And there's also a lot of performance and video documentation you can see on my website as well. And of course, you can see it here in the show, yay. Okay. Moving on. In the midst of that long-term project, I began another, also focused on facilitating dialogue with niche internet communities that are specifically not inclusive to women. So starting in 2014, I became interested in a figure named Rushvi. His writing and his ideologies seemed to overlap with a lot of the men I was talking to inside of World of Warcraft, who identified themselves to me as men's rights activists or members of the manosphere. So after seeing a lot of writing circulate on the internet about his book, Don't Bang Denmark, a country where I'd just been living, I decided to investigate further and began to read his books, his blogs, and his incredibly active Rushvi community forum. In case you're not familiar, Rushvi has been called the most infamous misogynist on the internet, and that's a pretty big claim, because there's a lot of competition for that. But he spends his time traveling around the world teaching men how to perform in particular ways in order to have sex with as many women as possible across geographic, language, and cultural barriers as quickly as possible. He writes a series of travel guides called Bang, Day Bang, Bang Iceland, Bang Poland, Bang Ukraine, Don't Bang Denmark, Bang Colombia, and so on. I did not make this image, one of his many fans did. He's also the founder of Return of Kings, a very active online, what we might now call alt-right blog, with many writers devoted to discussing neo-masculinity, a popular ideological term within that community coined by Rushvi to identify men who want to return to radically traditional family values and would like to see women in the United States have their right to vote be revoked, among many other, frankly, infuriatingly conservative things. My project Banged emerged out of reading his website, books, blogs, and community forum. After reading so much of his writing for his online devoted community of followers, one thing really stuck out to me. In Rush's many accounts of his sexual exploits, the perspectives of the women he's explicitly talking about in his books and web posts are never represented. So I decided that I wanted to create a web platform and book project through which I'd hope to give the supposedly thousands of women that Rushvi has had sexual exchanges with, using the extremely aggressive strategies outlined in his books, an opportunity to anonymously report or critique their experiences. After pursuing mainstream media distribution of my call for these women, it occurred to me that Rush knew about my project, as he put it on blast on his Twitter account. But his awareness of the project changed it for me. He became less of an abstract villain or monster that I was free to run a smear campaign on, and more of a person and more of a subject. I decided that I should stop mimicking shock media tactics that his own community might use in a different way, and move toward investigating further into actually trying to understand his motivations and the appeal that he and his practice held over his growing community of followers, many of whom make up what is now being politically called the alt-right. So I pursued getting Rushvi to do an interview with me via Skype. This took months of email negotiating and literally sending him one question per day over email at his request while he tested my commitment to the project and whether or not I would be submissive enough for him. The video interview ended up being accidentally 2 hours long and was very exhausting. I'm going to play 2 short clips from the interview to give you a sense of what it was like, though it's kind of hard to get the feel from just 5 minutes, but hopefully this 5 will be a good indicator. There is some sexually explicit talk in this clip, and including a mystifying conversation about female orgasms. So get ready for that.
I'm a heterosexual, normal man without any alternative lifestyle leanings. I'm just an average guy. And I feel
But you write these books.
Yeah.
So can you just for an audience that may not be familiar with the books that you've written, can you just describe a little bit about Bang, Day Bang, Bang, Iceland, Don't Bang Denmark, and so on? I love Denmark, by the way.
Each book is just basically trying to help men learn how to meet women and initiate sexual relationships, how to start a conversation with a woman, how to build attraction with a woman, how to get her into bed.
If you don't mind, I do want to read a section from Bang that maybe you could sort of respond to, because I think, based on what you're saying, some of the things then in Bang are maybe a more extreme version of what you're practicing now.
You may be trying to play this out of context type of game where you quote something.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I don't want to tell me to stop if you want.
Let's see, because I know that's what people have done. It's a full quote.
I just want. Well, I'll let you respond to it, because I don't want you to, get upset or anything.
If that's what I wrote, it's theirs.
This is just called "If you don't feel like a creep, you're not pushing hard enough."
Okay.
Yeah. This is a great start. And I get, I'm not trying to exploit you. I'm just. She's not going to invite you upstairs like in the movies. She's not going to tell you she wants to have sex with you. She's not going to grab your dick and put it in. You must always be making the first move and always be pushing. If you're scared, she'll think of you as a creep. That means you're on the right path. Remember that girls who like you are flattered that you want to have sex with them. So moving quickly is an indirect way of showing interest that can be helpful for new relationships. Get her to your place or hers the same night you meet her. Get her into the bedroom. Take off her clothes and keep going. If she resists, take a break and start over again. Break her down and bang her, and then take her out and bang her again. And then on page 90-something, pound away like a jackhammer until she gets tired and gives in. This isn't an elegant approach, but it works. Any human resistance can be broken down with enough pressure. I just feel like that's a little bit more extreme than what you were explaining earlier.
How did I not win the Nobel Prize?
Let's imagine that I do, somehow, find 20 women that have slept with you. What do you think these women might say about the seduction process and your sexual performance?
I would say that they would probably say that I approached them with good energy. I didn't scare them. I made them feel comfortable. I didn't come on really strong. But at the same time, I didn't come in with such a low energy that they weren't interested. I'm really good at keeping a conversation going, even if the girl is not giving me a lot back. I make everything feel natural, from how I touch and kiss, and I mean, it's rarely the point where a girl will have to stop me and say, no, I don't like it when you touch me there. Because I can read them. I know, but based on how they act, how they talk, how they move, when they want me to do the next step. And after sex, I get lazy, because now I already got most of what I wanted. So I just want to be able to have the lowest possible expectations. So that where I don't want to try. So it's actually a blessing and a curse to be good in bed. But I'm not.
You mentioned your orgasm is of primary importance, and that you don't go down on women. That's true. Can I ask why?
Because nature has deemed the male orgasm to be more important. If right now a magic cloud of gas surrounds the earth and infected girls and prevented them from ever having a female orgasm again, the human species would go on still. But if this cloud of gas only affected men and prevented the male orgasm, what would happen? The human species is done. It is freaking done. Therefore, nature, not me, nature has declared that the male orgasm is essential to life, But the female orgasm is like a cherry on top. You know, if she gets it, hey, that's great, yummy. But if not, it doesn't matter. So I'm just I believe in what nature has said about it.
Oh, the things that have been said in defense of nature. All right, so this is a video which is normally accompanied with audio that I made from one of the emails that I got nearly daily over the course of the project from Rush's community members. This project ended up taking on a lot of forms. Rush was initially enthusiastic about my search and the project in general, and his community initially appreciated the 2-hour-long interview because I acknowledged up front that I was a self-identified feminist inclined to disagree with him, but was willing to maintain civility with regards to my interview questions and my overall demeanor. However, as mainstream media continued to be interested in my search for his partners, his community became more and more frustrated that the media still had an overall negative view of Rush despite my unedited 2-hour-long interview with him. His community debated my project and harassed me over email, social media, comment sections of mainstream news sites, and a massive and still ongoing comment thread on the Rush V forum, and additionally wrote threatening statements to employers, friends, peers, and colleagues in an attempt to discredit what I was doing. They let me know that they knew where I lived and where I worked, and continued to sexually harass me, sent me rape and death threats, and accused me of stalking Rush. As the project continued to get more attention, Rush himself also suggested that if I continued my search, he would sue me for libel. I'm talking about this issue not to play up a victim narrative, as I certainly recognize myself as an agent who started this whole thing, but I feel like it's important to talk about this part of the process because I want to make it clear that in this online context, unlike World of Warcraft, a space where we're protected by avatars, when I interact with this particular online community, certainly there comes, with it higher risk. As a performer who had seen real impact on the space in World of Warcraft by facilitating these discussions across different sort of echo chambers, I naively applied some of the same logic and strategies to this project without realizing the primary difference in my position in these two spaces. In WoW, I was recognizable as a long-term, high-level member of the community with high-level gear only obtained through clearly years of commitment to the game. Clearly a participant and not an outsider. In Rush V's manosphere, I am an enemy. I'm a symbol of everything wrong in today's world to them, someone who operates against their values, and someone who, regardless of attempts to perform civility, and even at times feeling somewhere in there that there was some empathy, there was no way that this project would have ended smoothly for me. We'll just let this play out. WNB stands for would not bang. Normally there's a wah, wah, wah sound that goes there in a performance. But anyway, yeah, and as a result of this sort of realization of how vulnerable I was, I've since made my Twitter account private. The project ended up being published in a book, installed in art galleries, turned into a storytelling performance where I outlined the meandering nature of the project from the initial idea to different shifts in intention and politics, to finally being unable to publish the accounts of women I interviewed for fear of their safety. I wrote extensively about the process in an essay for Field Journal of Socially Engaged Art Criticism if you want to learn more and see some of the emails that I sent to him. There's lots more to say, but I'm just going to jump into where that led me. Toward the end of this project, something I felt was getting in the way of the work was my performance role. The project did very much become about my experience operating in this field. Despite my experience, I haven't abandoned the field, as you'll see in the video game project. I'm just putting myself out of the spotlight and making the project less about my mediation of and intervention in these spaces, and more about creating an embodied way for people to digest experiences from and ideologies of these manosphere seduction communities. There's so much information, behavioral psychology, and coded language in this field, and a lot of it is very painful to process, especially if you're a woman. And so with all of the experience I now have mapping the field, as a researcher, I'm able to put myself in the position to filter it all into a game scenario, so that one might actually walk away being able to make sense of it without having to spend as much time as I have inside of it, and hopefully develop tactics to respond to it. So this brings me to the game, which we'll play through together in a moment. After the Banged project, followers of other seduction gurus reached out to me to tell me that Ruche's variety of pickup art was much more extreme and much more misogynistic than other types that are more focused on teaching men confidence and self-improvement to help level the dating field. I thought that was a totally valid point, and I think things like this should exist. So I decided to take a deeper look into the variety of pickup artist gurus, or seduction coaches as they've reframed themselves, and the differences between the types of pickup art that they're teaching, and then ultimately make a game about them. So in this part of the talk, there will be some mentions of sexual assault and evidence of non-consensual behavior. And in the playthrough together, you might see scenes from the game that aren't necessarily graphic, but have a kind of sexually explicit nature to them. So if you're sensitive to that or have experienced trauma and you want to leave, I will not be in any way offended. So if you didn't get it from the title, The Game is a play on the best-selling book by Neil Strauss, The Game, which was the first mainstream primer into this world, which originated as a couple of guys with a Web 1.0 online community forum and turned into a lucrative seduction coaching lifestyle for some. So I made sort of a playable version of The Game, but looking at the entire field today, not just the pickup artists represented in that book. Ultimately, the game will be released online, but for now it's mostly been shown in art gallery and festival contexts. The most recent version we'll play through a bit of is on display at Squeaky Wheel Film and Media Center if you happen to be in Buffalo, New York. It's up through mid-December. But both versions involve 4 stations at a bar to play the game, which you'll see takes place in a bar. Made some ephemera. I also include in the exhibition all the books that I use to construct the dialogue in the game, as well as all of the notes that correspond to different things that happen in the game, as well as the original cyanotype prints I made, which contributed to the illustrations in the game. I'm not going to talk about that, but there's a banner. The band Shoo Shoo composed the soundtrack to the game, so it has a pretty considered dark and intense musical score, which you'll get to hear. So in developing the game, I present the different seduction techniques of famous pickup artists and allow those pickup artists to speak for themselves through their work and force players to interact with them in a common location for pickup art, the bar. Players, regardless of personal gender identity, are put into the position of experiencing a common scenario that femme-presenting people experience, having their personal space invaded when it's unwelcome by men who feel entitled to it. Chapter 1 focuses on research material from infamous pickup artist Julien Blanc's first major multi-DVD training program, PIMP. This is what the PIMP program costs now at a reduced price, if I've accidentally enticed you. All of the dialogue in the game is constructed from actual word-for-word advice written by these pickup artists in their books, websites, and DVD programs, and also situations from their own hidden camera footage that they sell to their devoted followers. A lot of these coaching materials are prohibitively expensive and not available in full online. Partially, I hypothesize, to keep people who aren't looking to learn from them from finding out about them and publishing things about them. But I got a grant, so I bought a lot of them. So I will show you one. So I'm going to show an excerpt from one of Julien Blanc's videos, which also includes an in-field hidden camera video. And again, there is clearly non-consensual behavior in this video. It's not graphic or anything. It's just, it is, like I would say, somewhat disturbing. So just putting you in the space for that. Okay, pimp.
So when I'm like, you know what, it's after party, let's go, I'm going to throw in the word now. Okay, like, you know what, after party, now. Boom, and I will order and command now. Now. Okay, listen, you don't have to if you don't want to, but let's go now. Okay, we get along, right? After party, now. Adventure, now. Let's go, now. This second, now. This second, now. Okay, I'm going to hammer that shit in. I'll also do like, you know what, after party, because otherwise I have to go. AKA, it has to happen now. Okay, so keep that in mind. Take the responsibility off of the girl and create a sense of urgency.
Kiss me goodbye or real kiss?
No, we're
very
done.
nice guys. I'll never see you again.
We're just assholes.
Don't give a shit.
But look, but Julien is a Frenchman.
Hey, we have so much in common.
Apologies.
What do we have in common? What do you
Pleasure
mean?
to meet you.
The connection. We're just like,
Ridiculous.
we're too similar.
Erica,
She won't see.
no.
I'll hide it. I have massive shoulders. She won't see.
Get out of town.
That's what she said. Okay, real fast, real fast.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
A real kiss, not shake.
You're crazy.
She's gone. Okay, we already kissed. It's too late. Give her a real kiss.
You're crazy.
Redemption. It's like a video game. Redemption. Are you gonna cheat on a shitty kiss?
No.
That's a good point.
Am I gonna cheat on a shitty
You already
Yes.
cheated. You already cheated.
What does that mean?
You cheated on a fiance on a shitty kiss. Is that really what you want?
Where did
2 minutes.
Where
Come
did
here.
you guys come
Wait.
from?
Can I just hug you goodbye? I'll hug you goodbye.
You can give me a hug.
Goodbye.
Okay?
2 minutes. Hug with me and kiss me. 2 minutes.
No, 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 no.
2
no,
minutes.
it's
2
not.
minutes. Okay, kiss me. See.
No, 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 no.
She can't see. My friend's talking to her.
Stop it!
So this pretty much covers, like aligning the emotional side of her brain with the logical side of her brain.
Okay. Yeah. So I showed that video not to shock you or anything, but to illustrate that this moment presented in Julian's hidden camera footage is represented in the game, and also represented as a success, I want to add. As a player, if you continue to engage with him to the point that you end up outside of the bar and are invited to leave the venue with him, even when you push back, you may be physically moved around and touched sexually without your consent. This is not me inventing what Julian is like in any way, but presenting him and his behaviors in the ways that he's presented them himself and has suggested them as a template for his many hundreds of thousands of online fans to follow. These are just some stills from the game. The second chapter of the game involves Luke. Luke is really Rushvi, who we heard about earlier, but in Russia, Rush was caught by a daytime talk show out doing pickup art and told his roommate and all the women he picked up that his name was Luke. So in the game, he's Luke. The dialogue in Luke's chapter is based on Rushvi's books Bang, 30 Bangs, and Bang Iceland, along with specific conquest stories from the non-fiction section of his website. After each interaction in the game, you're prompted with a series of options. Generally, the options include a tonal range from being enthusiastic, to being snarky, to being polite, to resorting to being aggressive in your rejection. Each option results in a different outcome, illustrating how the pickup artist has described ways of handling the different ways that women will respond to them. Each pickup artist handles rejection and women's overall attitudes toward them differently. For example, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but if you play through, you'll notice that Julian will persist until you physically push him away, whereas even the slightest hint of attitude or even confidence will signal to Luke that you aren't submissive and therefore aren't worth his time, and he'll leave immediately. As a player and as the target of pickup artists' attention, you can make a broad range of decisions in the game, from opting to hook up with different pickup artists in multiple locations to attempting to get away from them immediately. In constructing the game, I didn't want to make the point necessarily escape, and I hope that players, if they aren't triggered by it, do experiment with seeing what a successful conquest looks like from the perspective of each of the pickup artists. The game also, it's important to me that it never slut-shames the player by any means, and allows you to turn the tables and pursue the pickup artist yourself if you want to. I've tried to depict not only the breadth of the field of pickup art in the game, but also the extent to which each of these gurus are connected through their online community and copy their moves from each other, highlighting how community-based and internet-driven the men's seduction field still is. In both of these images, you can see that the old, like, hey, you should come watch something in my bedroom routine is alive and well in all of their storylines, and taught in these seduction gurus' books and videos and blogs. The game was made from hundreds of cyanotypes, and this is what it looks like when they're digitally combined and altered and then put into Python and RenPy. I really wanted the game to feel experientially not like any other game, and that's why I brought back some of my background in more traditional art processes rather than employing the all-digital sprite-based RPG look I originally planned to use. It'll be released in full online soon, hopefully end of January 2018. Before we play it together, which we will in a second, I also want to say it's also quite funny. For example, Julian is obsessed with Twilight and the Vampire Diaries series, and a great deal of his pickup lines involve those things. Roosh has this odd story that he tells about living off the land and growing only butter lettuce and organic watermelons. So it is entertaining at times, but I like to frame the project this way when I get the chance to before people play it, because it's just that sometimes this field seems easy to dismiss as not real. And when I talk about the field and the work and the impact that this field has on real people, I wanted to share with you some of the gravity of the situation by seeing it in practice. All right, let's play it. Can I get some house lights so I can see you? Because it's going to be totally interactive. Don't look at that. Notes. Okay, I'm going to open it up. All right, you can see it. I'm going to let you hear some of the sound, and then I'm going to turn it down a little bit in a second. So I can talk over it. Okay. Yeah, it's a little quiet, but... Okay, so what I'm going to lead you through is how we're going to play this as an audience. But first we have to go through the setup. I give a content warning right away, so nobody sort of lands on this without kind of knowing what they're getting into. But you got a much longer content warning, so I will kind of skip through that. So when we go through this and we get to a point where there's a decision that can be made, I'm going to say to you, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then you will shout out wherever you want us to go. And in the unfortunate great nature of consensus, whoever's the loudest is going to be who I go with. So sorry about it. I don't know how else we'll do it. I'm not going to let you choose here, though, because if you want out, it's okay if you have to leave. Okay. And it is a bit of reading, so sorry about that. And if I'm going too fast, just feel free to tell me to slow down. One or two? One. Thank you, because yeah, the other way, it would have been a real short playthrough. Wait, I meant to set a timer so we don't go too long. Okay, timer started. Great. One, two, 3, or 4? One. This part is really to just get you used to the interface and how to play, and to set the scene. He's not one of the pickup artists. One, two, 3, or 4? 2. Heard it? I heard 2 first, sorry, and loudly. One, 2, 3, or 4? 4. 1, 2, 3, or 4? 4. A lot of 4s. 1, 2, 3, or 4? 2. A lot of 2. One, 2, 3, or 4? 4. 4? Okay. One, 2, 3, or 4? 4. 1, 2, 3, or 4? 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? 3. If you're not familiar with West Virginia, that is an insult. 1, 2, 3, or 4? I heard 3s. Oh, sorry, I hit the wrong button. 1, 2, 3, or 4? 3. 1, 2, 3, or 4? 2. One, 2, 3, or 4? 2. Natalie, are you telling me that we should wrap up?
We've got 11 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll give 2 more. Sorry. Yeah.
Unless you want to play this rather than Q&A.
I think a Q&A would be good. So yeah, we'll give it 2 more minutes. Yeah, if you just want to say when you want it to be, yeah. Okay. One, 2, 3, 4. 4. You're bad people. Okay, we'll stop here, but this would have been your next opportunity. But yeah, magic tricks. Okay. Thank you so much.
Sorry to cut you off. I mean, I think it's one of those things that you could probably play the whole game several times, but... Thank you so much for your presentation. It's always really great to hear a lot of the research behind work anyway, but in particular because it's such a innately kind of personal work as well. And I guess because we've talked quite a lot about this in the last kind of couple of days, and the idea of the monstrous in particular is that really interesting dynamic, because I'm aware from watching your presentation you're very careful not to instantly go for the kind of the bad possible, spooky, and the dark, terrible one. You do embody that environment and you put yourself in the centre of it. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more on how you kind of explored that dynamic.
Yeah, I think like one of the impulses for making like all of the works, it was initially that the media environments that we're in now are so polarized or so kind of isolated from, environments that are different from us, filter bubbles, echo bubbles, these are some terms that we use. And so I wanted to create works that attempt to still acknowledge my positionality and who I am. So not an interventionist sort of sensibility of like the older way we think about interventionist practice, where it's like wear a suit and sneak in and, and I admire the artists who come from those practices, but it's a very male-dominated arena because women are very rarely afforded the opportunity to be considered valid in a space. It's harder for women to pass as authority, so much of the interventionist practice that I admire involves that kind of performance. So who I am is always kind of has to be present. And so I think it's important for me that when writing, Rushvi has been written about so much, especially in spaces like Jezebel and spaces where it's just very easy to dismiss what he does and make fun of him and make very quick, highly clickable, clickbaity articles about what an asshole he is. And I can confirm he certainly is. But I think when we're dealing with monsters in the way that we have in the media landscape today, I think it's really important to go toward complexity and to look for the specificity of how these sorts of figures come to power, rather than dismissing them. Because I think, at least coming from the United States, we had an election where somebody was certainly came to power after so much sort of attention given to how much of a joke it was and how monstrous he was. And so yeah, I think figuring out why these practices are appealing is important in trying to dismantle them.
And it is an interesting way. I was noting down the point you made about the fact that you're kind of always providing that mediation point, where it's like you don't have to go through this and experience what I experience, and have to go into this in-depth article, and also not have to actually go through it in the physical world. This is why your work kind of enables people to, I mean, I'd say live through in a very maybe not the right sense, but to almost like rehearse or understand those processes in a way that they can essentially kind of quit the game if it's too much. And that kind of thing I think is really important, because obviously, again, sadly, that's not what happens in real life. Because we've got a limited time, I do want to open it up to the floor. Anyone got any questions? Marion?
Hi, thank you. That was great. That was fantastic. I had a question to your project that you had with Rush. So you mentioned the fact that his community was directly contacting you and attacking you, and you had to eventually make your Twitter account private. So concerning your work, I was wondering how it really affected you on a personal basis, and was it like something that was a bit of a drive that forced, like, that made you carry on harder, or was it really hard? Like, I mean, surely it was, but if you didn't mind talking about it, sorry.
Yeah, I'm happy to, well, not happy, but I'm certainly willing to talk about it. Yeah, I mean, I have a performance that I do that's about an hour long. It's like a theater piece where I go through the process of the work, and a large amount of it is going through like some of the personal messages that I've received, and also trying to like replay through what it's like to have, also given like with ubiquitous computing and notification culture, that you're constantly being notified that something is happening to you, and that you're at the center of you know, this sort of attention. And yeah, it was devastating, because I've had a pretty optimistic and even, I would say, somewhat utopian sort of romanticism about early Web 1.0 culture. That's why I love World of Warcraft. That's why I romanticize the net. It was really important to me, having grown up in a very rural, very I don't know, normal farm town, to what the internet did in terms of opened up like the scope of what I could do and what I could see was really important to me. So yeah, having this kind of realization that within the way that real name policies work, the way that we're sort of linked to all of these different places, how easy it is to find out what, or even just the way that I post, or I'm at this place doing this thing today, became like, made me very, very aware of what that means when there's a large group mobilized looking to stop you. And I became very aware. I've had people come to events, certainly more around the time of the project, that was more of an issue, but yeah, so it's horrible. And you know, I think that platforms like Twitter are starting to finally talk to more people who have had these experiences, especially given this was also around the time of Gamergate, so I had a whole nother, if you're not familiar, it was a social movement designed to silence alternative perspectives in game development. And yeah, so I was also a target of that movement, so I had these two like groups, and there's not surprisingly a lot of overlap between those groups. But yeah, it was, you know, it was a really rough year.
Thanks. Hi. First of all, I want to say thank you for showing a really positive example of how we can use empathy to make social change. Not shutting down the other side, but actually trying to enter a dialogue, and I think it's extremely cool. So you mentioned a moment ago that understanding why these things are appealing for people is the key to shutting it down. what kind of ideas do you have of how we can divert sort of the energy that these communities have to more positive directions?
Well, I appreciate that question. There are a few things I think developers of the various platforms that we're now dependent on really need to be much more engaged and aware of how their platforms are being misused, and create robust systems for reporting abuse. And also defining what abuse means. There's a lot of criticisms from at least the American right about the shutting down of free speech. When somebody's being abused, when they report it, the argument is, well, it's my free speech. I have the free speech to abuse you. And that's just ridiculous. I think platforms have to be much, much, much more in tune with the experiences of their users, and be willing to, at the expense of the bottom line, be willing to make the changes that will potentially lose parts of their user base that are, white supremacists. So, I think that as on a structural level, what needs to change. I think on an individual scale, I don't have an answer to that necessarily, but I do think changing the sort of clickbait media language that we have, because I think that's really impacted the way that people interact with each other, to embrace complexity, entanglement, and be willing to be more open to more gray areas, I think, but also not, because I think it's important for me that I'm not saying that the behavior of these groups is okay. Like, I don't think that it's okay. So I think I'm not trying to encourage it, but anyway, I'm kind of rambling now. So.
Thank you.
We've got 2 questions. 3. How much time have we got left?
1 minute over time.
No. Who had put your hands up?
1, 2.
Cutting into that minute.
I know I'm cutting into it. Do we have if it's 3 short ones, we don't have time, do we?
I can be really fast.
Okay.
Maybe.
Really quick question, but I know it'll have a long answer, so we'll have to keep talking. But I was curious to see, like, thinking about this idea of empathy, who, your audience was on the other side, like in terms of, these people who wrote you and were interacting with you in that way. Were there people who also, played the game, had an interactive experience via the materials you created, and then was able to, have a positive turnaround of sorts?
Yeah, there's quite an interesting, I get regularly emails, which I should probably mention in the context of this as well, not to just dwell on the negative, but also I get emails all the time from people who say that the interview kind of changed they'd never actually talked to a self-identified feminist before, that there are none of them in their world, so they had this sort of monstrous idea about them, and that I was able to provide an example of the wide ways that feminists sort of present and act, and that we are willing to listen sometimes to some extent, and also in the forum, if you ever want to Google a horrible 300 post forum, there's a pretty intense discussion about my role, and a lot of people really appreciated it and ended up getting banished from the forums over time. So you can also see sort of how that played out. But yeah, there's definitely, it's not all negative, it's true.
Yeah, thanks. I was, in response to what you said before about maybe regulations on platforms, I totally see the point, of course, but doesn't this also create problems? For example, it would move or push people into maybe more secluded communities where actually maybe people, build this sort of bubble where maybe these opinions actually kind of also become stronger, and people, how do you say it? They reinforce their opinions also. So isn't this also what happened to actually create these kind of 8chan, 4chan bubbles sort of
I would argue that World of Warcraft has become just like that because of the lack of robust policies for reporting harassment. And a game like Final Fantasy XIV, which is another MMO game, has a very different harassment reporting policy, and the community is consequently much more diverse. And also much more generous with each other. So, I mean, I think the default, if you don't do that, is that they turn into spaces like 4chan.
Yeah, it's actually on. Cool. What I was kind of missing in the thing was like because I think you hardly went into like what the people who actually buy the products from these pickup artists, like what kind of people they are and like why they actually buy this product. So my question would be like, where do you think this demand for these kind of products comes from?
A long answer, trying to make a short answer. So the demand comes from people want to figure out, I think it's a legitimate need, actually, to try to figure out how to interact with women in public without making them feel unsafe. Like, that's the need that these pickup artists are trying to fill, and I think it's completely legitimate that there would be things to help people with that. I think, unfortunately, the pickup artists have an attention monopoly on the ways to do that, and their practices vary widely and are very... They're not consent-oriented, and they reinforce different sort of ideas of biological determinism around what women want, what they are, and who they should be. So I think, that the audience for this is people who are like really do want to legitimately understand how to interact with women. And I certainly don't have a problem with that need. I think it's the way that it's being sort of fulfilled through these practices that I'm most critical of. Thanks for that question.
Great. Thank you very much, Angela. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
We've got a bit of a break, and then we have Adam Curtis, if you've managed to get tickets. I'm sorry. There is an over. I was literally bribed today with a couple of objects, which is quite interesting. They didn't win. Didn't get it. It's fine. A T-shirt. So thank you very much again. A round of applause for Angela. And I look forward to playing the game.